Many thanks for staying with us. You're still watching Village Square Africa. Now, Zimbabwe is currently experiencing a brain drain like never before, especially in the education sector, where about 300 teachers are leaving the country every single month. The primary cause of this mass exodus is the comparatively low wages in Zimbabwe compared to other Southern African nations. Now, while salary increases are challenging due to economic constraints, the country must find ways to retain, and not just retain, but attract teaching talent. The average teacher in Zimbabwe earns a maximum of $350 per month, leading to a loss of qualified teachers vital for mentoring the nation's learners and budget constraints hindering the employment of additional teachers needed to support the country's students. So, what to do? Well, joining us to have this conversation now, we're joined by our guest, Obert Masaraure. He's the National President, Amalgamated Rural Teachers Union of Zimbabwe in Harare. Thank you so much, Obert, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Greetings, viewers.
Right, it's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us as well. Now, Obert, talking about the issue of brain drain in Zimbabwe. I mean, brain drain is no new phenomenon. Zimbabwe has had that issue for a long time, and even not just Zimbabwe now, other African countries. But for decades, the country's education system was respected as one of the best on the continent. And that's one of the few accomplishments of the former president, Robert Mugabe's regime. So what would we say went wrong from then till now that is leading to such massive exodus of people from the country to other countries?
Yeah, thanks so much for raising that critical question. I think to begin with, we have to appreciate the ideological disposition of the regime of Robert Mugabe when they came from the liberation war post-independence. Soon after independence, Zimbabwe tried to have a socialist approach where social service delivery was a priority. But as years went on, because of economic mismanagement, they failed to deliver with regard to social service. So the only way was then to adopt economic structural adjustment program as prescribed by the neoliberal agenda of the international financiers in the early 90s. But of course, things were still better because the political will to provide social services was still there. But now under Emmerson Mnangagwa, we now have a regime whose priorities do not include provision of public goods such as education. So we've seen a massive cutting of expenditure on education, for example. Under Robert Mugabe in 1980, 23% of our national budget would go towards education. But from 2017, when Emmerson assumed the office, we have never had a budget allocation more than 13% of the annual budget. So what we simply have to do, we are dealing with is grappling with this ideological disposition, which is against providing public goods to the people. We have neoliberalism taking over, but we also have massive corruption. So we have underfunding for the sector, and we also have massive repression, where people are not allowed even to speak out when they are hungry. So teachers are in a dilemma where even when they are hungry, they are not allowed to complain that they are hungry. We have seen massive arrests of people. I've been abducted twice myself just for complaining that our salaries are low. I've been in prison for months because of complaining that our salaries are low. So in the context of massive repression, coupled with underpayment, people would then try to find their way outside of that context. If it was only underpayment, you would agree as a nation, you shut the way forward to say, how do we resolve the national crisis? But when you are not even given a chance to dialogue, only what you get is a prison sentence. What you get is a punishment from your own government. Then people choose to run away. And this is why we have almost 18% of our teachers having left the country from January to date.
Right. All right. Thank you for that. Now, before we go further, we're now joined by Gladman Chikwari. Gladman is a public affairs analyst in Harare, Zimbabwe as well. Gladman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We're talking about brain drain in Zimbabwe. And although our focus is on the education sector and the mass exodus of teachers from the country, we're also going to take a look at other sectors, because this cuts across different sectors, like the health sector, for example. Now, some months ago in the health sector, Constantino Chiwenga, the country's vice president, did say that there are plans in place to criminalize foreign hiring of their health workers. That's to say that if people leave their country to other countries to find jobs, it will now become a criminal offense for those countries to hire them. And, people are asking, is that necessary? Is that the step forward? What do you think about that?
I think it's a desperate situation to try to curb people not to go outside. But for me, they are not addressing the issue, because what we need is to find what it is that is causing people to go outside. And what it is there are poor living conditions, poor salaries, and anything that has to do with the remuneration is poor. And worst of all, considering the medical situation in Zimbabwe, everyone who is not well is prescribed parasite and painkillers. It makes life not easier for those in the medical field. And since outside they are given better remuneration, better working conditions, people tend to move. So address the situation that is affecting people before moving, before criminalizing the act of moving away from the countries.
Very well said, Gladman. I mean, I think that is just spot on. And talking about the measures that should be taken, Obert, instead of criminalizing the hiring of these people, are there plans in place by the government to at least ensure that these people get better remuneration, get better working conditions? Is there anything being said in that direction by the government?
Unfortunately, we don't have much in place at the moment. There isn't much in place from the government. And you will be shocked to know that the government of Zimbabwe denies workers in the public sector basic rights, like the right to collective bargaining, a right to engage in job actions. Without these fundamental rights, people would then choose to run away. But we are pushing the government to then have a reform, because our constitution is clear that it provides for these rights. So we are pushing our government to align the ancillary laws that are denying public sector workers such fundamental rights. We have always argued that if you give the workers the right to strike, you give them the right to collective bargaining, most of them will find space to dialogue with their employer. They will find it easier to express their challenges and find solutions with the employer. But without dialogue between the employer and the employee, we will not get a solution to this. So this has been our prescription, and we will be pushing hard to ensure that by end of these 5 years, with this term of government, which was recently elected, we would have managed to have reforms of the legal regime which is governing labor in the public sector for now. For us, that is the biggest interest that is stopping government from dialoguing with these workers. They have an attitude where really they are not affected by the crisis in the public sector. Their sons and daughters do not learn in Zimbabwe, in Harare. They get exotic education in Australia, in the UK. So those in government simply don't care. When they need health care, they don't access it in our public hospitals. It's either they are in a very expensive private hospitals or they're accessing exotic health care in China, US, among other destinations. So we have people who are supposed to be running the provision of social services for the public, but they don't want to access the same because they know that they are not prepared to deliver for the people. So the worker in the public hospital, the teacher in the public school is not a priority for the government of Emerson Mnangagwa, because their own sons and daughters do not access services from those particular stations.
All right, Obert, let me still stay with you now. There is obviously now a shortage of teachers in the education sector, doctors and medical health workers in the health sector, as well as many other sectors in Zimbabwe that are affected by this brain drain issue. What is the fate of these different sectors if nothing is done to curb the massive exodus of people from the country? What would the fate of these sectors be in general?
So already what we're witnessing is that these sectors are now in the intensive care unit. We now have shocking teacher-learner ratios of up to one teacher attending to 140 learners in some circumstances. We now have shocking statistics where one teacher can teach up to 7 subjects at a secondary level, which is unacceptable. So what this means is that the quality of education being accessed by our people is now of the worst quality. And also those teachers who are still in the schools are just people who are failing to get opportunities to leave. So we have teachers who are already in what I can call a flight mode. We are waiting for their moment to leave. So those people don't give their best to the sector. And what that automatically means is that our education becomes, the quality really is degraded. We fail to achieve the agenda, Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which we are trying to chase with the rest of the world. We fail to achieve even our own local targets that we have set for ourselves through our National Development Strategy 1. So when we miss those developmental targets, we then remain trapped in a context of underdevelopment, where obviously you would expect that with the level of the economic performance of Zimbabwe, we should be targeting economic growth that is higher, double-digit economic growth. But we will not be able to get there if our people are not getting educated. And what this means is that we have the girl child getting teenage pregnancies, we have them getting into early marriages, we have our young girls and boys getting into drugs. We have massive dropouts because the quality of the education, when it's poor, is not inspiring. And people don't see the reason why they should stay in school. So we are recording massive dropouts. People taking to drugs, people taking to child labor, among other things. We have teachers who are leaving the school to sell tomatoes on the streets. So I basically can say our public services are now in the intensive care unit. I am glad Gladman spoke to the issue of the state of our healthcare system, where if you, by some chance, need some medication of any sort, you are so sure that you won't get it in a public hospital. You have to have a private arrangement. So we now have an absent government when it comes to social service delivery, and these sectors have collapsed. So what it means is that.
All right. Okay, Obert, thank you for that. Thank you so much. Now, finally, I'm going to ask you, Gladman. Some time ago, we're talking about this same issue of brain drain, but how it affects Nigeria. You know, the different sectors in Nigeria, the health sector, especially with doctors. You know, the same way Zimbabwe has the issue with teachers and health workers. We have the same with doctors in Nigeria. And, you know, there were talks of making of silver linings, basically how these brain drain is going to help the country to generate more revenue. So I want to ask, is it the same for Zimbabwe? Can the same thing apply in Zimbabwe?
It can apply considering we get the revenue from the different countries that these people are going, and there is a mechanism where we can collect remittances from the doctors that have fled the country or that have gone outside the country. But it's not a workable model considering the collapsing of the system in Zimbabwe, where people are suffering because we don't have doctors and we don't have nurses and we don't have nurse aides. Everyone is going outside. So the money, if it comes, it will not sustain anyone. It will not be working, because the ratio of patient to doctor is way miserable. So what we generally need first is we need the doctors themselves, and then we can talk about money. But in the first instance, we need the doctors, then we need the nurses having a better life for themselves, then they can treat patients well. Then after, we can say those that can train, we can manage to train human resources that we can export. But for now, our current crisis is on having an adequate number of nurses and doctors. Then we can start talking about remittances from outside.
All right. Well, that said, we have come to the end of our conversation. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Gladman Chikwari, Public Affairs Analyst in Harare, Zimbabwe. Also, Obert Masaraure, a National President, Amalgamated Rural Teachers Union of Zimbabwe. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. All right. It's been a very interesting and insightful episode of Village Square Africa. Thank you to the viewer for watching. Thank you also for tuning in. Don't forget to join us again for more episodes of VSA as we discuss, dissect, and analyze issues as it pertains to African continent. And don't forget, the news comes up next, so stay tuned. I'm Blessings Mosugu.